Well, friends, this is the third in our series of talks on Jeremiah, the cost of commitment today. And in this last talk, I want to speak about living hope in a strange land, whether it's Jeremiah's or yours. Now, let me start with a question. Where do you get your sense of identity? Where do you get your sense of identity? Traditionally, you know, people have gained their sense of identity from three main things: family, community, and work. As children are placed in the family, and the family's embodiment of love and fairness are crucially important. And later, the community around us becomes a further important place where we develop a sense of who we are. Among our friends, in the neighborhood, in school, and university. Here we develop a sense of our place in the wider world. And later still, our work helps to define us. In the home, in the office, or as teachers, doctors, lawyers, blue-collar workers, skilled or unskilled. But sometimes all of this gets out of hand, and we become either proud or resentful, workaholic or manipulative, forgetting that our chief means of identity should be in our relationship with God. And we should get it from our relationship with God, whether all these things are around us and prospering or not. Because it's from that one relationship with God that all other relationships can best be assessed and regulated. But what happens to us when all these other means of identifying ourselves are taken away from us? Then we face disorientation, anonymity, and depression. It can happen on an individual scale, for instance, when a powerful person retires and has no power or influence left. It can happen when a person gets very old and ill and loses their strength and their former beauty and their friends and even perhaps family, many of whom will have died. And it can happen when hardship or persecution forces people to become refugees and asylum seekers, losing the familiarity of home and the status of career. They pine for family far away, and they struggle with menial jobs they would never have taken back in their home country, where their abilities were recognized and their training was used. And so such people, torn away from all the places from which they got their identity, live in a strange land where even the language is a barrier to understanding and being understood. Well, all that's at an individual level. But as we read in Jeremiah, and in, for instance, chapters 29 to 31, at this stage in the history of Israel, Old Testament Judah, imagine what it was like for the Jewish prisoners of Nebuchadnezzar, hauled off in chains to trudge the 700-mile journey to Babylon, to be resettled on the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. Many were separated from family and friends forever. Also saw those same family and friends similarly degraded, disorientated, and despairing. You see, at that point, everything had changed for large numbers of Jeremiah's people who were shipped off in the first deportation. Everything had changed. All the reassuring familiarities of home had disappeared. The hills of Judah left behind for the weary, flat, monotonous landscape of the Babylonian plain. The temple of Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the joy of the whole earth, the temple left behind for the tents of the refugee camp. The unifying culture of Israel since Abraham and Moses and before, now challenged by the alien customs of other displaced peoples, and the religion of Yahweh placed alongside the gods of Babylon, as though Yahweh was just one of the crowd now. It wasn't as if the Jews were very badly treated in Babylon. The foreign policy of the conquerors, you see, allowed them to settle in enclaves and form new communities and work their little land and grow their food and speak their language. New friendships would be formed, and in time marriages and families would once again build up the community. Skills would be learned, language barriers crossed, and tribal identity regained. But the memory of home, and the disgrace of conquest, and the ruin of Jerusalem and the temple, those irreplaceable landmarks of religion and calling, they would always be there, those memories, to undercut confidence in the present and to cloud any hope for the future, unless God prevented it. And above all, they were there because of the judgment of God, these Jews in Babylon. The judgment of God, their God, on their nation, the nation he had chosen, and now seemed finally to have cast off. Now, you might have expected a prophet like Jeremiah, who'd been talking about this since long before it seemed possible, let alone likely, and who saw it in its different stages happening, vindicated at last. You might have expected the prophet Jeremiah to have no word of comfort left as he contemplated the just judgment of God on a faithless people and their treacherous leaders. But you'd be wrong. At the blackest time in the nation's history, when the darkness was almost absolute, a light was struck. And in chapter 29, we have Jeremiah's famous letter to the exiles. That is, to those particularly of the first deportation after King Jehoiakim's death, when the cream of the nation, the leaders, the nobles, the craftsmen were taken, together with the young King Jehoiakim and promising young men who could serve Nebuchadnezzar's civil service, were all shipped off to exile. But his letter actually will apply to all the exiles after as well. And this is surely one of the most moving and encouraging chapters of the book, as we'll see. And the implication of its message is immeasurably important and precious. Even in Babylon, they are still the people of even in Babylon, they need not lose and must not lose their identity, who they are, and to whom they belong. In spite of all the failures and provocations that we have in the book, God could say in Jeremiah 31:3, I have loved you with an everlasting love, and I have plans for you to fulfill your destiny and take your place in history. God tells them, I know you, where you are. You are not lost in the crowd. I am there as well as back home. I know you as mine, on the plains of Babylon as surely as in the hills of Judah. You are still the same people, my people. And I will purify you by this suffering and restore you to your land. You are as precious to me in exile as you ever were at home. I am still your God, even in your backsliding, and I will bring you back. And I will stay with you now and lead you in my paths all the way home, long and tortuous as that way might be. And meantime, says Jeremiah, meanwhile, prepare for a long stay. Develop community and prosperity. Make your contribution to the wider society and this must have been astonishing, seek the peace of Babylon. Seek the welfare of the conquering city. Now, there's an abiding and an ongoing lesson for us in all that. A lesson that helps us today in the real world of disappointment and struggle, where Christians often feel exiled, often feel strangers in a strange land, and often feel distanced from God. One of my young women came up to me in the church years ago and said, "It's wonderful here on Sundays," she said, "but why is it I feel so flat by Wednesday?" So I said, "Well, it's not surprising, is it? You feel flat on Wednesday because you live in a flat world. I mean, that's what you're getting over the airways, on the television, at work, in the conversation around you. Godlessness, a godless world, the godless arts and crafts, the godless politics, the godless work that you're doing. It's all seen by them to be without God. And you have to learn to see God in it all, because it's His world, and these are His ways and gifts. And so there's a lesson to us in our own exile, as it were. It tells us how to be the people God wants us to be in a place where we don't want to be. How to live in the little exiles of life, in a job we don't like, or among neighbours who don't understand us, or in a country which rejects our God, or among people whose attitude to the most precious things in your life is the sneer and the shrug. To put the issue as a question, and to put that question in contemporary terms, how can you be a Christian in a non-Christian society? Now, we can offer several responses to that from this passage. I'm going to major on one of them. If we are to be Christians in a secular or non-Christian society, we must be found first responding to the calling of God. That's in chapter 29 and verses 4 to 7. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. To all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Now the Jews were to be in Babylon for 3 generations before the opportunity to return would be given, a period formerly known as 70 years. And in that time, they were to be engaged with the culture, but not absorbed by it. They were to retain their essential Jewishness, but to be engaged with the daily life and duties, promotions and responsibilities of loyal citizens in Babylon. They didn't have the temple and its sacrifices or its festivals, but they still had their elders and their communal organizations. They also had the Jewish Sabbaths and the mark of circumcision on all their males, to express their distinctiveness as the chosen people of God. The Sabbath was the wedding ring of Israel. That's why it's there in the middle of the 10 Commandments. It was to be the perpetual visual reminder that they were not like the other nations, that they had been set apart for God. And so they had their set-apart day where they could celebrate that truth. And most importantly, in Babylon, they still had God's prophets. Not the false ones, the true ones. But they were not to be escapists, much less rebels. They were not to have the attitude that they owed nothing to their new masters. Now we have a perfect example of that at a very high level of engagement in the story of Daniel, don't we? Told in the earlier chapters of that book in the Old Testament. Daniel had been taken as a young man in that first wave of nobles and promising, well-educated young men. Daniel had been taken to Babylon in the time of King Jehoiakim, about 8 years before these others, and about 8 years before Jeremiah was writing this chapter. And he retained his Jewishness, did Daniel, in things great and small. In the food he ate, and in the prayer times he kept, as well as in his exclusive worship of the one true God. And yet, he also rose through the ranks of Nebuchadnezzar's civil service, a faithful and trustworthy servant of Babylon. And eventually, as you know, he became a chief minister and a man of very great power and responsibility in the Babylonian Empire. And there's something else, or someone else I should mention. In the larger deportation after King Jehoiakim's death in 597 BC, a young priest had been taken away with many others. And his name was Ezekiel. And he too would become a major prophetic figure among the Jews. But it would be in Babylon, not Jerusalem, that he would fulfill his ministry. And there, Ezekiel would challenge and nurture Judah's life in exile. There he would raise the horizons of the exile to the future of God and the world calling of the Jews. Various writers in the New Testament take their cue from all this, and they too refer in one way or another to various communities of Christians as God's exiles. God's exiles in the world, strangers in a strange land. Our truer home, they would say, is heaven and the future of God. But they also said, but we have duties, and we have duties here to the people, the authorities, and the states to which we belong as fellow citizens. And they maintained this great balance, which is always there. The challenge is to be engaged with the culture, but not absorbed by it. The challenge is to be engaged with the culture, but not absorbed by it. It's a great mistake, and even a sin, when Christians and the Christian church develop a mentality that becomes so resentful of the world around, and perhaps so disgusted with some of its challenge, with some of its standards and practices, that it cuts itself off and refuses its role to be salt and light in society. We must never forget that the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1. I urge then, first of all, that requests, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and all in authority. And the multiplying of terms there suggests perhaps serious and particular involvement with the decisions of Parliament and the events of nations. When our newspapers become our prayer books, we might see more done in our world than we ever thought possible. And similarly, both Paul and Peter command a right submission to the governing authorities. In the letter to the Romans, chapter 13, and in Peter's first letter, chapter 2. And that is a recognition that law and order and the principle of authority in government is of God, however it may be abused in our world. Christians may be a third race, but they are never to be a fifth column. They are to recognize the place and the need of justice, truth, order, sometimes the lesser of evils, but often joining with others in a united front towards fairness and justice and truth. And those others may not be of our faith or any faith at all. And there's more. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. Now, salt in the old world, as you know, did the job of refrigerators in our own. It slowed down the process of decay in meat. It didn't make the leg of lamb suddenly bleat and frisk about the kitchen. It didn't convey life, but it slowed down decay. And so, social involvement, political involvement, and our general work of itself can't regenerate our society. Only revival and repentance, the preaching of the gospel, and the turning to Christ can do that. But to be effective, salt has to be rubbed in. And we have to be rubbed in to our society if we are to help counteract the processes of moral and spiritual decay that are everywhere present around us. Jesus said, you are the light of the world. But he warned that light could do no good hidden under a basin. And so too, while it's he who is himself the light of the world, we can only be its light as we have him in our daily lives and take his truth and salvation and good news to others. Salt and light, and both demand contact and involvement. Christians in a secular society belong as citizens of that society with contributions to make, voices to be heard, values to share. They don't have all the answers, and often we will meet people in the world who are wiser than we are, who have deeper insights than we have, who are more aware of dangers than we, and they might not be of our faith at all, but they are exercising the gifts that God freely gives to humankind. He salts the world with wisdom, and he gives us people of excellence whom we can well admire and pray for. But Christians must be involved in politics, education, and neighborhoods, as well as churches, as well as in churches, prayer meetings, and house groups. We are citizens, you see, of two worlds: the kingdom of God and the state or nation to which we belong. We have duties to both. We must seek the good of the city as well as the good of our own church. We need people to be involved with local politics, schools, and housing associations. Help for people locked into prostitution and drugs, soup runs, and social services. We need Christians in them all. We need more Christians on local councils, more Christians as school governors, more Christians as members of parliament, more Christians in the world of the media and the arts, more at every level to work for truth and justice and good standards in public life. God says in every age to all of those who are his people and who are as yet still living in exile, seek the peace and prosperity of the city. Be engaged with the culture, but not absorbed by it. Don't lose your distinctiveness as Christians. Don't lose your unique identity. Shine as lights. Hold back the darkness. And while no one can do everything of all the things I just mentioned, we can pray as churches and individuals for different ones in their different ministries, with all their challenges and opportunities. Of course, it's equally necessary not to be absorbed by the godless culture we live in, equally necessary to retain Christian faith and devotion at the center of all we do, because these things lie at the heart of our own lives and are the hope of the world, did the world but know it. We are not to allow our work, even in a needy world, to cut us off from God who made the world and who seeks to save it. We must not lose the voice of the Spirit in the spirit of the age. And that is not always an easy thing, because Christians involved in some of the more difficult areas of our society are bombarded with temptations and challenges and complications and restrictions and political correctness that demand that they walk a very careful path, and even a knife edge, as Daniel must often have done in Babylon, where there must have been uncounted numbers of rivals, place seekers, politically correct people who wanted his job and anybody else's that were going, and where he had to somehow be this diplomat, this strategist, this civil servant, as well as this man of God, this man of uncompromising faith. Jeremiah would have understood all that. And when you look at our world and our times, read the excellent book Christian Manifesto of Michael Schluter of the Jubilee Foundation, with its close application of a Christian mindset and values to law, to medicine, to education, and many other areas and aspects of our modern world. You'll find exciting ideas and possibilities for your work and your workplace there. Being Christians in a non-Christian society involves then, first of all, responding to the calling of God. And secondly, it also involves remembering the future of God. You know, they did rather well in Babylon, those Jews. In fact, they did so well that lots of them didn't want to return when they had the opportunity to return. And if you read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, if you've never read them before, you'll find out what happened to the different waves that returned over the next 90 years or so. And you'll discover that they were, for a while, quite a beleaguered minority, while there were many who stayed in very comfortable positions back in Babylon. Thank you very much. We can be good Jews here too. We really don't need to go that far back. You can't go back in life, they might have said. And so there is an urge, a warning and a call to remember the future of God. In chapter 29, verses 10 to 14, this is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. So Jeremiah was concerned that they remembered the future of God, the future God had for them even in Babylon. But I have to say to you tonight, but even that wasn't all, or anything like all, the future God had for them. Yes, they did come back in dribs and drabs and hopeful convoys, and they did start a new work. When they laid the foundations of the future, some cried and others sang and shouted for joy. Some remembered the great days, and others thought these must be the great days. But through the years they often faltered, and they needed prophets like Haggai and others to reprimand them and to urge them forward, because it was very easy to fall away from Jerusalem, which is a hard place to live in, and be content with their little farms and dwellings in the new communities and villages that they were building among the hills of Judea. It was very easy to forget the bigger future God had for them. Some of them, a few centuries on, thought that the bigger future God had for them lay in revolution, in political rebellion, in nationalism. And you had the terrible wars of the Maccabees, who were, of course, far more sinned against than sinning, but who suffered dreadfully for their misplaced hope in revolutionary politics and in rebellion and in war. But God had a better future than that, too. In fact, he would surprise everybody with the future he had, because it would begin with a young, fairly anonymous carpenter who was a late descendant of the Davidic line, which had fallen into obscurity. And it depended on his wife, the Virgin, Mary of Nazareth, and the child she carried in her womb. The future of God included that young family fleeing for a while to Egypt, but then coming back and up to Nazareth to safety. The future of God involved that baby growing up into manhood and living a life like no other and speaking like no other. The future of God involved that same man dying a death like no other and bearing the sin of the world before the judgments of God, suffering the worst cruelties of human wickedness in the pain of crucifixion, but beyond that, in his deepest self, standing before the bar of the judgment of God and bearing the wrath and the indignation that was due to this whole planet for its cruelties, its rebellions, and its sins. And that incomparable life, that incomparable death, was succeeded by a glorious resurrection. You know, as you read the New Testament, you don't read so often Jesus rose from the dead. What you read is God raised his son, Jesus, from the dead. It is not an isolated incident from Jesus' life, which is why people dismiss it so easily. It is also something that is not independent of God, as it were, a phenomenon in the universe. It is God's statement about God's plan from the foundation of the world, that sin would not have the last word, and that this race would be unique and would share his future in a unique and endless joy. That was in the future. None of them realized there was a greater future than all the futures that they could imagine in Jeremiah's day and after. And that led on to some surprising twists in history. Let me tell you something that you might not know about these exiles that remained in Babylon. They remained there for generations. They remained for hundreds of years. And then a certain king, who was kindly disposed to them, Antiochus III, I think, he relocated, according to Josephus, 2,000 Jewish families. And he relocated them hundreds of miles south to what we call Asia Minor, Roman Asia, to Bithynia and Lydia and those places. In fact, very close to the very areas where in the fullness of time the Apostle Paul would come with his gospel and bring to Ephesus and the surrounding towns and cities and to other parts of that region the gospel, founding churches and beginning a new chapter in Christians' history. But the first believers there were Jews, and they would probably have been Jewish descendants of the Babylonian exiles. There were also others who were sent from Rome. I won't go into that. But you see how God can take the threads of history and weave them in a tapestry of extraordinary beauty and glory and joy, and show his sovereignty in human history. But there is a future beyond that too, because in the ongoing flow of history, areas that were once rich in Christian faith and heritage become barren, and the pillar of cloud and fire moves on, if you'll excuse me taking a very Old Testament metaphor. And we find that other parts of the world become the new cradles, as it were, of Christianity in a new age. And God uses those too. But the time is going to come. Oh, the time is going to come when all the little exiles and all the little recoveries and all the little returns will end in one glorious final return, with no more exile. Jesus put it all in famous words. Let not your, just before his own death, knowing his resurrection, knowing his identity and his future in God, let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I wouldn't mislead you. I wouldn't deceive you. It's better to translate it as a question. If it were not so, would I have told you? Would I lead you to a false hope and down the garden path? And you know, when he says, in my Father's house there are many rooms, he's using a very familiar image there. He's using the image of a first century Palestinian home, which basically consisted of the father's central house, and the family would be brought up there. One of his sons would marry, and he would bring his wife to live, but not in the central house, in another house specially prepared for him, in the compound. And then a second son would get married, and he'd bring his wife. And you'd sometimes get a compound where you'd have the central original home, and around it, clustered like chicks around a hen, a series of other places. And that's the word that Jesus uses. It isn't mansion in the old 1611 version, taken from a Latin origin, and it isn't rooms in the kind of house you and I live in. It's these dwelling places. It's these homes. And what Jesus is really saying is, in my Father's compound, there are many rooms, and there is room for you. Room for you. And through the ages, millions have seen the end of all their exiles, and have seen their return to the Father's house, to the great compound, to the future of God. That's where Jeremiah was pointing. That's where Jesus awaits us. That's where the hope of the world lies. Whatever life brings, whatever history brings, ultimately, the victory of Christ on the first Easter Sunday proclaims the victory when the exiles are all brought home. Thanks be to God. Amen. Let's bow in prayer. Oh Lord, our Father, we come to the end of a long day, and perhaps we're a little bit tired, but we praise you that the keeper of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. We praise you that you are never weary. We praise you that we can trust you for safety this night, for guidance in the days to come, and most of all, despite this uncertain world, we praise you that we can trust you with uttermost confidence, for the day our little exiles end, and we are brought into the glory of your house. Keep us with this hope in our hearts, and as we live in this Babylon of a world, in this troubled nation, as we live in all the grief and injustice that we read of in our papers, as we live in a world where there is so much injustice and persecution, as we live in a society where there is so much materialism and immorality, as friends around us fall prey to temptation and betray their marriages and their trust, as we see around us people dying in the night, and even your people suffering in the midst of it all, grant that by prayer and witness, by outshining lights, we might drive back the darkness and proclaim Jesus, the light of the world, wherever we are and wherever we speak. For we ask it in his name.